Hi again. In my previous video, I talked about how protracted or learned withdrawal is not all in our head. And this is a similar video where I want to talk about how learning withdrawal is not our fault. I want to get into this because one of the core ideas of a mind-body approach is that the brain has learned withdrawal sensations, and it's learned them through psychological stress. And this often leads to questions like, is this my fault? Did I do something wrong? Is my brain doing something wrong? Or are we letting psychiatric drugs off the hook? If it's not the drugs, is it me? So there's a number of questions there, but I'd like to address the questions about psychiatric drugs first. Let me just say that I despise psychiatric drugs as much as any person can despise anything. And I was fed a bunch of lies about them, and they substantially harmed my quality of life. I also had withdrawal syndromes from them, which were all terrible, right? And all of my negative experiences with psychiatric drugs were invalidated, and I was gaslit by psychiatrists who kept insisting that the drugs are safe and effective and not causing me any problems at all. Maybe that sounds familiar. So when I first heard about the mind-body syndrome, honestly, I found the idea very offensive. The idea that somehow my own brain or emotions were prolonging withdrawal reminded me of psychiatry, blaming me. And my loathing for psychiatrists is so immeasurable that I really didn't even look into the mind-body syndrome for 5 years after I first heard about it. I had drug damage anyway, so I thought, what's the point? But as I started looking into TMS more, I had to start asking myself questions. Like, how could my brain still be reacting to a drug I'd taken years ago? Or when I was still tapering, how was my brain reacting so strongly to these very small microcuts I was making? Anyway, what proof did I have that I was still literally in withdrawal? Were there no alternative, non-psychiatric explanations available? If so, why was I not considering them? So I started digging into John Sarno, the mind-body syndrome, and the subsequent work of Howard Schubiner and others. And I realized that, yes, while psychiatric drugs can definitely cause acute withdrawal, it's possible that the brain can memorize our withdrawal experience and learn to reproduce withdrawal sensations on its own, to continue them. I mean, the brain can basically learn anything if we spend a lot of our time on it. And God knows I spent virtually all my time thinking about withdrawal. That's the first thing I thought about when I got up in the morning, and it was the last thing I thought about when I went to sleep. Now, does this mean it was my fault that I worried about withdrawal so much? No, of course not. Often we worry about withdrawal in a way that seems out of our control. So learning withdrawal is unintentional. Also, learning is an unconscious process. It happened outside our awareness. Otherwise, we wouldn't have allowed it to happen. The point being is that no one gives themselves protracted withdrawal. It's not our fault. Without an education about what was happening to us, how could we have possibly responded any different to our situation? I mean, I'm someone who can be extremely hard on myself, as many people who are in protracted withdrawal probably are, and not even I can blame myself for this. What's actually more relevant and important to get into and acknowledge is that things in my life, they happen to me. Hard things. And if I, or we, already felt not so safe in our lives or our bodies, this can make us more susceptible to worrisome states that are so accommodating to learning withdrawal or pain or stomach problems or chronic fatigue or what have you. So for me, no, self-blame was not the answer. What I needed was compassion for myself, for what I'd gone through, to soothe myself and my brain. And speaking of which, I couldn't even blame my brain either, because as I delved into TMS materials more closely, I realized that my brain learned withdrawal to protect me. I was filled with rage and sadness about my life, some of which I was conscious of, but this was just the tip of the iceberg of deeper emotions that were threatening to bubble to the surface. So to protect myself from feeling the depth of these unbearable emotions, my brain redirected my attention onto withdrawal sensations to distract me, to learn them. This is partly why, I think, we feel drawn to focus on withdrawal sensations in a way that seems seemingly out of our control. Now, although this is a survival mechanism meant to help us with all this internal tension, it can get way out of hand and give us unimaginable suffering, right? Well, the human brain is imperfect, but nature is compassionate enough to give us neuroplastic brains so that we can unlearn some syndromes we don't want happening to us, like withdrawal sensations. And we can do this by engaging in the mind-body approach and becoming aware of these deeper emotions inside of us. So ultimately, for myself, I now see the mind-body syndrome as helping me to recognize my own health, even my own humanity, as opposed to psychiatry that aimed at blaming everything on an alleged illness. But when it comes to the mind-body approach, this is not true at all. Nothing about this is our fault. We didn't give ourselves protracted withdrawal, and our brain didn't either. In fact, our brain is trying to protect us. Now, sometimes this is hard for people to take in. It certainly was for me. And John Sarno thought that only a small percentage of people would actually accept these ideas. Some may accept them right away, some after a long time, like me, and others not at all. And that's okay. There are different paths to healing, and people have to find what's right for them. Well, that's it for today's video, and I hope to see you again if you're interested in this mind-body approach.